7 years is a long time to ignore a woman who has been quietly keeping your world from falling apart. The white roses arrived at Blackwood Manor just as the first line of rain began to crawl down the tall windows of the great hall. They came wrapped in silver paper, tied with a pale ribbon, and carried by a footman who looked as though he regretted every step that brought him across the marble floor. Duchess Eleanor Blackwood stood beneath the chandelier, one gloved hand resting lightly against the carved banister, her face composed in the way all lonely women eventually learn to compose themselves. She did not reach for the flowers at once. For 7 years, nothing beautiful had arrived in that house for her, without a purpose behind it. Invitations needed answering. Charities needed signatures. Tenants needed mercy. Her husband needed silence. But these roses were different. They were not addressed to the Duchess of Blackwood. They were addressed simply to Eleanor. She read the card once, then again, and something moved across her face so softly that half the servants missed it. A smile. Not large. Not careless. Not the bright, foolish smile of a girl who believed herself adored. It was smaller than that, and far more dangerous. It was the smile of a woman remembering that she was still alive. From the shadowed archway leading to the west corridor, Duke Everett Blackwood saw it. He had returned from the council meeting in Ashbourne 2 hours earlier than expected, his black coat still damp at the shoulders, his leather gloves folded in one hand. At 38, Everett had the grave elegance of a man born to command rooms before he entered them. Servants lowered their eyes when he passed. Men measured their words around him. Women in society called him cold and meant it as both criticism and praise. Yet at that moment, looking at the wife he had barely spoken to over breakfast, he felt no command at all. Only a strange tightening beneath his ribs, sharp enough to make him still. Eleanor's fingers touched the edge of the card. The candlelight turned her wedding ring into a thin circle of fire. Everett had placed that ring there 7 years ago with steady hands and an empty heart. He remembered the cathedral, the winter light, the way she had looked up at him as though there might yet be kindness between them. He had given her courtesy instead. Separate rooms, polite dinners, formal appearances, a life without scandal, without cruelty, without warmth. He had thought restraint was mercy. He had thought distance was honesty. Now another man had sent his wife roses, and Eleanor had smiled at them as though they had brought sunlight into a house Everett had left in winter. Who are they from? His voice crossed the hall before he meant it to. The footman stiffened. Mrs. Graves, the housekeeper, went motionless near the staircase. Eleanor turned slowly, the bouquet held against the dark blue silk of her gown. She did not blush. She did not hide the card. The girl he had married might have trembled beneath that tone. The woman before him only lifted her chin. Count Adrian Caldwell, she said. Everett knew the name. A widower. A patron of hospitals. A man with easy manners and a reputation for remembering the small things other men forgot. Eleanor's thumb brushed the ribbon, and the movement irritated Everett more than it should have. And why? He asked, each word measured. Is Count Caldwell sending flowers to my wife? The silence that followed was so complete that the rain against the windows sounded almost loud. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were gray, he noticed suddenly. Not pale, not cold, but gray like morning mist over the south gardens she had restored without asking his permission. How many years had those eyes been sitting across from him at dinner? How many times had he failed to see them? He sent them in thanks, she replied, for the winter relief fund. A letter would have been sufficient. Perhaps he wished to be kind. Kind. The word entered the hall like a match touched to dry paper. Everett's jaw tightened. He had not forbidden kindness from her life. He had simply never considered that she might need it from him. Eleanor lowered her gaze to the card once more, and though her smile had faded, something gentler remained in its place. Gratitude. That was worse. A wife could endure neglect. A duchess could survive gossip. But gratitude toward another man was a door opening in a wall Everett had not known was there. You seem pleased, he said. Eleanor's fingers closed around the stems. When she answered, her voice was quiet enough that only those nearest could hear, yet it struck him with the force of a church bell. After 7 years, Your Grace, it is still pleasant to be remembered. Mrs. Graves inhaled softly. The footman stared at the floor. Everett did not move. 7 years. The words did not accuse him loudly. They did not need to. They stood between husband and wife like 7 locked doors, 7 cold winters, 7,000 evenings in which Eleanor Blackwood had sat beneath his roof and learned not to wait for his footsteps. Outside, thunder rolled over the estate. Inside, Everett looked at the roses in his wife's arms and understood, too late, that something had awakened in him only because something in her had finally begun to leave. Everett did not sleep that night, though he had spent 7 years mastering the art of lying still beside absence. Long after the servants had withdrawn and the corridors of Blackwood Manor had settled into their old winter silence, he remained in his study with the door closed, the fire reduced to a red glow, and the scent of white roses lingering in his mind as though the flowers themselves had been laid upon his desk. Eleanor had taken them to her rooms. He had noticed that. He had noticed too much. The careful way she had held them, not as a young woman accepting flattery, but as someone receiving proof that the world had not entirely forgotten her. He poured no brandy. He opened no letters. Instead, he stood before the darkened window and saw, reflected faintly in the glass, the face of a man who had mistaken silence for dignity. 7 years earlier, the church had been filled with pale light and cold whispers. Eleanor Whitmore had walked toward him beneath the high stone arches in a gown that looked too delicate for the season, her veil trembling slightly each time she breathed. She had been 21, perhaps younger in spirit, with hope carefully hidden behind obedience. Everett remembered thinking that she was beautiful in the distant way portraits were beautiful, something to be preserved, not approached. His mother had stood in the front pew, satisfied at last. The Whitmore alliance would strengthen Blackwood holdings in the South. Eleanor's dowry would settle old disputes over land boundaries. The marriage was sensible, necessary, clean, nothing like the reckless, aching love he had buried with Lady Margaret Vale. Margaret had laughed too loudly for drawing rooms and played the piano after midnight with the windows open. Margaret had once told him that duty was only a cage if a man loved his chains more than his heart. Then she had died in spring rain on a road outside Ashbourne, and every warm thing in Everett had gone quiet. By the time Eleanor came into his life, he had already made himself into a mausoleum with a title. At the altar, she had looked up at him when the vows were spoken. He had not looked back long enough to see what it cost her. At the wedding breakfast, she had thanked every guest, remembered every name, and smiled even when the older women studied her with pity. That evening, when they were finally alone in the vast ducal chamber prepared by generations of Blackwood brides before her, Everett had stood near the fireplace, unable to bear the innocence of her nervous hands folded before her. "You need not fear me," he had said. Eleanor's shoulders had eased for one fragile second. Then he had continued, "This marriage was arranged for duty. I will provide you respect, comfort, and protection. I cannot provide what I do not possess." The color had drained softly from her face, though she did not weep. "I understand, Your Grace." "Everett," he had corrected, because it seemed a harmless mercy. She had nodded. "Everett." He had arranged separate rooms before dawn. Not with cruelty. That was the defense he used for years. He had not shouted. He had not humiliated her. He had not denied her money, servants, clothes, or authority. He had simply removed himself from every place where tenderness might have taken root. In the beginning, Eleanor had tried. He remembered it now with the punishment of sudden clarity. A vase of fresh lavender appeared in his study because a footman had once mentioned he disliked heavy perfume. A breakfast tray was sent during a week of difficult estate hearings, with tea prepared exactly as he took it. Once, on the anniversary of Margaret's passing, Eleanor left a single white flower outside the locked music room, not as a challenge, but as a condolence. Everett had found it at sunrise. The sight had struck him with such sharp grief that he ordered the flower removed and told Mrs. Graves that no one was to touch that room again. Eleanor had heard. Of course she had heard. Blackwood Manor carried pain through its corridors better than it carried music. After that, the lavender stopped. The breakfast trays became formal. The invitations to walk in the gardens grew fewer, then disappeared entirely. Year by year, Eleanor became perfect. Perfectly dressed, perfectly calm, perfectly unreachable. And Everett, fool that he was, had called that peace. A soft knock touched the study door. Mrs. Graves entered with a candle and the careful expression of a woman who had served the family long enough to fear truth but respect it more. "Her Grace has retired," she said. Everett turned from the window. Were the flowers placed in her sitting room? Yes, Your Grace. Did she ask for anything else? Mrs. Graves hesitated. Only fresh water for the vase. The answer should not have wounded him. It did. Everett looked toward the cold corridor beyond the open door, toward the eastern wing where his wife had lived for 7 years like a guest who had overstayed no welcome because none had ever been offered. Tell me something, Mrs. Graves. His voice was low. Has she been unhappy? The housekeeper's hand tightened around the candle. For a moment, the only sound was rain striking the windows. No, Your Grace, she said at last, with devastating gentleness. Not lately. Everett looked at her. What does that mean? Mrs. Graves lowered her eyes. It means she stopped expecting happiness here some time ago. The door closed behind her, leaving him alone with the fire, the rain, and the terrible understanding that Eleanor's smile over another man's roses had not been the beginning of betrayal. It had been the first visible sign of a farewell that had started years before he noticed. By morning, Blackwood Manor wore the color of wet stone. Rain clung to the ivy along the eastern walls, gathered in silver threads on the window glass, and softened the gravel drive until every carriage wheel left a dark scar behind it. Eleanor woke before the bells, as she always did, not because anyone required it of her, but because 7 years of loneliness had trained her body to rise before hope could. Her sitting room smelled faintly of roses. White petals opened in the blue-gray light, elegant and quiet in their crystal vase. And for a moment she stood before them with her dressing robe gathered at her throat, wondering why such a small kindness could feel heavier than grief. Count Adrian Caldwell had not written anything improper. That was what made it dangerous. There had been no declaration, no secret promise, no line a gentleman could not defend in public. Only gratitude, only remembrance, only her name. Eleanor, not Your Grace, not Duchess, not the woman seated at Duke Blackwood's left hand because custom required it. Eleanor. She touched one petal with the back of her finger and felt its softness, alive and brief. Then she withdrew her hand as if tenderness itself had become something she no longer trusted. The first years of her marriage returned to her in fragments, each one polished by pain until it shone too clearly. She remembered the first dinner she arranged after their wedding, when she had spent an afternoon learning from Mrs. Graves that Everett preferred roasted chicken with rosemary, potatoes crisped in butter, and coffee served without cream. She had worn a pale green gown because her mother once said it made her eyes gentle. Everett arrived late, apologized with perfect courtesy, and spoke more to the steward about drainage reports than to his wife. She had told herself he was tired. The second week, she asked whether he might walk with her through the South Gardens. He said the wind would be too sharp. The next morning, she saw him cross the same gardens alone, black coat moving between the bare hedges like a shadow that had somewhere else to belong. She had told herself he was grieving. By the third month, she had learned not to ask questions whose answers would bruise her. But loneliness has its own memory. It remembers where a chair sat empty. It remembers the sound of one fork against china in a room prepared for two. It remembers the peculiar humiliation of servants pretending not to notice that the Duchess had stopped listening for footsteps outside her door. Eleanor, dressed in dark plum wool, chose pearl earrings small enough not to invite comment, and went downstairs with the calm face Blackwood Manor knew best. In the breakfast room, Everett was already seated. That alone made her pause. He rarely came to breakfast unless guests were present or estate business required a performance of domestic order. The long table stretched between them, polished mahogany reflecting the pale morning like still water. His newspaper lay unopened beside his plate. "Good morning," he said. Eleanor took her seat. "Good morning, Your Grace." Something crossed his face at the title, too slight for a servant to notice, but not slight enough for her to miss. Once, years ago, he had asked her to call him Everett. She had done so carefully, as though his name were a fragile cup placed in her hands. Over time, he had taught her to return it to the shelf. Mrs. Graves poured tea. The footman moved quietly. For several minutes, the room held only the civil sounds of silver, porcelain, rain, and two people performing a marriage that had become easier than speaking truth. Everett looked at her hands. "Did you sleep well?" The question was so ordinary that Eleanor nearly failed to understand it. She lifted her eyes. "Well enough." The storm continued most of the night. So it did. He waited, perhaps for more. She gave him nothing cruel, nothing warm, only the exact amount of conversation he had cultivated in her. Everett's fingers tightened around his coffee cup. You have a meeting at the village school today? Eleanor lowered her spoon. Yes. With Caldwell. There it was. Not concern. Not curiosity. The hidden thorn beneath the linen. Eleanor felt no anger at first, only a tiredness so deep it seemed older than her own body. Count Caldwell is one of several patrons attending. He seems an attentive patron. She met his gaze then, fully. The room became still around them. Attention is not a fault, Your Grace. The words were quiet. They landed cleanly. Everett said nothing. She stood, and the footman stepped forward to pull back her chair. At the door, she paused, not because she wished to wound him, but because some truths asked to be released after being held too long. You need not trouble yourself about today, she said. I have managed my work without your interest for many years. Then she left him there, at the head of his own table, surrounded by wealth, obedience, and the first unbearable evidence that his wife's politeness was no longer patience. It was distance. The village school stood 3 miles from Blackwood Manor, at the edge of a narrow lane bordered by dripping hedgerows and winter-bare oaks. By the time Eleanor's carriage arrived, the rain had softened to a silver mist, clinging to her cloak and darkening the hem of her plum gown as she stepped onto the worn stone path. The building was modest, only 2 rooms beneath a slate roof, but warm light shone from every window, and the sound of children reciting their lessons drifted through the damp morning like a fragile hymn. Eleanor paused beneath the doorway, letting that sound steady her. Here, at least, her presence had weight. Here, no one looked through her, as though she were a portrait hung in the wrong hall. Miss Abigail Reed, the schoolmistress, hurried forward with ink on her fingers and relief on her face. Your Grace, the new readers arrived yesterday. The children have been nearly beside themselves. Eleanor smiled. Then we must not keep them waiting. Inside, the room smelled of chalk, damp wool, firewood, and paper. 30 children sat at long wooden benches, their boots tucked beneath them, their faces bright with the disciplined excitement of those who had known too little and were grateful for enough. Eleanor moved among them with ease, asking after a younger brother's cough, praising a girl's careful letters, adjusting a torn sleeve with a pin from her own cuff. She did not perform kindness. She practiced it, quietly and thoroughly, as other women practiced music. Count Adrian Caldwell arrived near noon, bringing a parcel of maps for the geography wall and a box of oranges from his estate greenhouse, each fruit wrapped in paper as though it were a jewel. The children stared at them in wonder. In Blackwood Village, oranges in winter seemed almost impossible. Your Grace, he said, bowing with warm respect. I feared the roads might keep you home. The roads have endured worse than rain, Eleanor replied. So have you, I suspect. His voice held no pity, and that was why it reached her. Pity pressed down. Understanding made room. They stood near the schoolroom hearth while Miss Reed distributed the oranges, the children's laughter rising like sparks. Adrian looked toward them, then back to Eleanor. You have done something remarkable here. I signed papers and troubled the right people until they surrendered funds. That is not all you did. She lowered her eyes to the gloves in her hands. Compliments still felt unfamiliar when they were not attached to duty. The children needed a place where poverty did not decide the size of their future, and you gave them one. Eleanor looked across the room at a little boy carefully sounding out the word river from a new reader. Her chest tightened with a tenderness that had nowhere else to go. I only wanted something in Blackwood to grow. Adrian did not answer at once. When he did, his tone was gentle. It has. Neither of them saw Everett standing outside beneath the dripping eaves. He had not planned to come. That was what he told himself as his horse waited near the lane, steam rising from its dark coat in the cold air. He had left the manor after Eleanor, intending only to inspect the lower fields damaged by the storm. Somehow, the road had carried him here, to the small schoolhouse his wife had built through persistence he had mistaken for harmless occupation. Through the window, he saw her as the village saw her. Not silent, not ornamental, not forgotten. A child tugged at her sleeve, and Eleanor bent at once, listening with complete attention. The firelight touched the curve of her cheek. Adrian Caldwell stood a respectful distance away, watching her with an expression Everett recognized before he wished to. Admiration, not hunger, not presumption, something cleaner and therefore more threatening. Everett had received admiration all his life. It came with the title, the land, the Blackwood name stamped into silver and law. But Adrian admired Eleanor for the life she had made in the spaces Everett had abandoned. For the first time, Everett understood that his wife had not merely survived his absence. She had filled it with purpose. He was still standing there when an older woman entered the schoolroom, carrying a basket of mended scarves. Mrs. Lane, a tenant's widow, caught Eleanor's hands between her own and spoke with tearful gratitude loud enough to be heard through the cracked window. "If not for you, Your Grace, my Samuel would have left school by spring. You gave him more than books. You gave him a chance." Eleanor's face softened in a way Everett had not seen in years. "He earned that chance, Mrs. Lane. I only opened the door." Everett stepped back from the window as if the words had been meant for him. Open the door. How many doors had Eleanor stood before in his house, waiting for him to do the same? Behind him, a carriage wheel sounded on the lane, and he turned just in time to see his mother's black coach approaching, the Blackwood crest gleaming through the mist. Duchess Victoria had come without warning, as she always did when she intended to judge before listening. Everett felt the old coldness settle across his shoulders. Inside the schoolhouse, Eleanor still knew nothing of the storm gathering at her back. She stood among children, books, oranges, and firelight, unaware that the world which had ignored her was about to arrive and demand she become invisible again. Duchess Victoria Blackwood entered the village school as if she had stepped into a room where every surface might stain her gloves. The children fell quiet one by one, their oranges held carefully in small hands, their lesson books left open upon the benches. Even the fire seemed to draw itself lower in the hearth. Eleanor turned at the sound of the door, and for one brief second, surprise crossed her face before discipline replaced it. "Duchess Victoria," she said, offering a respectful curtsy. "We were not expecting you." Plainly, the older woman's gaze moved over the maps, the chalkboards, the patched coats hanging near the entrance, and finally the children, who watched her with solemn eyes. She wore black silk trimmed in silver, a widow's armor polished into elegance, and carried the Blackwood pride like a sharpened fan. "I had not realized my daughter-in-law had taken to hosting public displays in schoolrooms." Eleanor's hands remained folded before her. "This is not a display. It is a funding review for the winter term." Count Adrian Caldwell bowed. "Your Grace, the school has benefited the entire parish. The Duchess has been tireless in its service." Victoria's eyes touched him, cold and brief. "How generous of you to supervise another man's wife in her tirelessness." The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Shame has always known how to walk quietly into a room and choose its victim. Miss Reed looked down. Mrs. Lane clutched her basket. Eleanor felt every child listening, every adult pretending not to, every inch of the old wound opening beneath her ribs. She had endured whispers in ballrooms, pity in church pews, and the long gray courtesy of a husband who had left her untouched by tenderness. But this was different. This was her school, her little sanctuary of slate, paper, and firelight. "Count Caldwell is a patron," Eleanor said evenly, "as are several members of the county board, and yet it is his flowers that decorate your private rooms." The room became still. Outside the window, Everett stood beneath the eaves, his expression hardening as the words reached him through the rain-damp air. For years, he had allowed society to explain Eleanor in whatever terms it pleased. Barren, convenient, forgotten, gracious enough, poor thing. He had heard such phrases and offered silence, believing silence to be restraint. Now he heard his mother place the same cruelty inside a schoolroom full of children, and something in him recoiled. Eleanor did not look toward the window. She did not know he was there. She stood alone, as she had stood alone so many times, and the dignity in her face made his chest ache. "If you have concerns about my conduct," she said, "you may bring them to me privately." Victoria smiled without warmth. Conduct becomes public when a woman forgets the weight of her name. Adrian took one step forward, but Eleanor lifted a hand slightly, stopping him without looking. That small gesture struck Everett harder than any defense. She did not need rescuing from a scandal she had not made. She needed the world to stop mistaking her restraint for guilt. "The Blackwood name," Eleanor said, her voice soft, "has been safe in my hands for 7 years." A murmur passed through the room. Not rebellion. Recognition. Mrs. Lane's eyes filled with sudden courage. "Begging your pardon, your grace," the widow said to Victoria, her voice trembling but clear. "It was the Duchess who kept coal in our houses last January. It was the Duchess who sent Dr. Hale when the fever came. If the Blackwood name means mercy here, it is because of her." Miss Reed raised her head. "And because of her, 12 children who would have left school are still learning." The children sat straighter. Little Samuel Lane, no more than 9 years old, held his reader against his chest like a shield. Victoria's face did not change, but the air around her did. Authority, when answered by truth, often discovers it has been standing on borrowed ground. Eleanor's composure faltered for the first time, not from humiliation, but from the dangerous tenderness of being defended by people who owed her nothing except gratitude. Then the door opened behind Victoria. Everett stepped inside, rain dark on his coat, his presence drawing every breath toward him. His mother turned, startled. "Everett." He did not look at her first. He looked at Eleanor. Really looked. At the damp hem of her gown. At the ink mark near her thumb. At the quiet exhaustion she had hidden better than jewels. Then he turned to the room. "The Duchess of Blackwood requires no correction for serving people I neglected to notice." Victoria stiffened. Eleanor's lips parted slightly. Everett's voice remained controlled, but there was iron beneath it, and something rawer than iron. "Count Caldwell is welcome here as a patron. Mrs. Lane is correct. Miss Reed is correct. And my wife has carried the honor of this family with more grace than anyone in it deserved." Silence followed, vast and trembling. For 7 years, Eleanor had imagined many impossible things. She had imagined Everett laughing. She had imagined him taking her hand in public. She had imagined him saying her name as though it mattered. She had never imagined him standing before his mother, before tenants, before children, and choosing her. Yet even as the room warmed around that choice, Eleanor felt no triumph, only sorrow, because some defenses arrive so late that they do not heal the wound at once. They merely prove the wound was real. The ride back to Blackwood Manor passed beneath a sky the color of tarnished silver. Eleanor sat on one side of the carriage, Everett on the other, with a careful distance between them that felt larger than the 3 miles of wet road stretching from the village school to the estate. Rain traced trembling lines down the glass. Beyond it, the fields rolled by in muted browns and winter greens, divided by low stone walls and scattered with cottages where smoke rose from chimneys she had helped keep warm. Everett looked at her once, then away. Twice. His hand shifted as though he meant to speak. Twice, he said nothing. Eleanor was grateful for the silence and wounded by it in equal measure. At the manor, Mrs. Graves met them in the entrance hall with the expression of someone who had already heard enough from returning footmen to understand that something irreversible had taken place. Duchess Victoria had chosen not to accompany them. She had departed for the Dowager House in her own coach, leaving behind the scent of cold perfume and unfinished judgment. Eleanor removed her gloves slowly. Her fingers were chilled, ink still faintly marked near her thumb from helping Samuel with his reader. Everett noticed it again, the small blue stain. The hands of a woman who had built a life from neglect and called it duty because there had been no safer word. "Eleanor," he said. She paused at the foot of the staircase. It was the first time in years that her name had sounded in his voice without ceremony surrounding it. "Not Duchess. Not your grace. Eleanor." The name crossed the hall and found the younger self inside her, the girl in the bridal veil who had once believed being called by her name might mean she was being welcomed. She did not turn fully. "Yes." Everett stood beside the cold marble table where visiting cards lay unopened in a silver tray. He looked different in daylight after the schoolroom, not softer exactly, but less certain of the armor he had worn so long. "What my mother said today should never have been spoken." "No," Eleanor replied. "It should not have. I am sorry." There it was. Small, late, almost unrecognizable in that house. Eleanor closed her eyes for half a second. She had imagined those words many times during the first years, imagined them after lonely dinners, after forgotten birthdays, after evenings when she dressed for events he did not attend and returned to rooms where no one waited. In those imagined moments, his apology had always opened something inside her. But now, hearing it at last, she felt only how far it had traveled and how much had died along the way. "Thank you," she said. Everett stepped closer, though not too close. "That is all. A faint, tired smile touched her mouth. What else would you have me give you? The question struck him silent. Eleanor turned then, facing him beneath the portraits of Blackwood ancestors who had watched generations mistake pride for strength. Gratitude? Relief? Tears. I spent years hoping you would notice when I was hurt. Eventually, I learned to stop arranging my pain where you might see it. His face tightened. I did not know. No, she said gently. You did not ask. The words were not cruel. That made them worse. Cruelty could be defended against. Truth entered quietly and rearranged the room. Everett looked toward the east corridor, toward the wing that had been hers in every practical sense and never in the one that mattered. I thought I was sparing you. Eleanor's gaze did not move. From what? He drew a breath, and for the first time, she saw the old wound beneath the title, beneath the clean collar and severe composure. From a husband who had nothing left to offer. For a moment, the hall held both of their ghosts. Margaret, whose memory had been kept behind locked doors, and Eleanor's younger hope, which had been left outside them. Everett, she said, and his eyes lifted at the sound of his name. Emptiness can still take up space. Yours filled this house. He flinched as though the sentence had touched something tender. She did not apologize for it. The truth had cost her too much to soften now. I will be in my sitting room, she said. There are letters to answer. She climbed the stairs without waiting for permission, each step measured, her gown whispering against the stone. Everett remained below until she disappeared from view. Then he turned, not toward his study, not toward the west wing, but toward the long corridor that led to the locked music room. The key had hung for 7 years inside his private desk, untouched except on the anniversary of Margaret Vale's passing. He retrieved it with hands that were not quite steady. When the music room door opened, stale air breathed out, carrying the faint scent of dust-covered wood, and a grief preserved too carefully to remain holy. Sheets draped the piano and chairs like sleeping ghosts. Margaret's portrait stood above the mantel, her painted smile unchanged by time, untouched by consequence. Everett stood before it for a long while. I made a shrine of you, he whispered, and a prison of everyone else. The room gave no answer. The dead never do. They leave the living to decide whether memory will be a candle or a chain. By dusk, Eleanor passed the corridor and stopped. The music room door stood open. Inside, Everett was removing the dust covers one by one. He did not see her, or perhaps he did and had learned, finally, not to demand witness for the first decent thing he had done too late. Eleanor stood there only a moment before continuing on. Her heart had not forgiven him. Not yet, but somewhere in the house, a locked room had opened, and for the first time in 7 years, Blackwood Manor seemed to exhale. By the next morning, the open music room had become the rumor no servant dared to repeat above a whisper. Dust covers had been folded and carried away. Windows that had not been raised in years stood open by 2 inches, letting in cold air scented with wet earth and distant pine. The old piano, once hidden beneath a sheet like a memory too fragile to touch, gleamed darkly in the gray light. Eleanor saw it when she descended the east staircase with a stack of letters in hand. She stopped at the corridor's edge, not entering, only looking. Everett stood inside with his back to her, speaking quietly to a carpenter about repairing the warped shutters and to Mrs. Graves about fresh curtains. The portrait of Margaret Vale remained above the mantel, but someone had placed a single white rose beneath it. Not a shrine, not an apology, a farewell made with respect. Eleanor felt something move in her chest and immediately mistrusted it. Hope was not dead. That was the cruel discovery. It had only learned to lie still. She continued to the morning room, where the accounts for the Winter Relief Fund waited beside 3 invitations and 1 sealed letter bearing Count Adrian Caldwell's crest. Her fingers paused over it. She had expected thanks for yesterday, perhaps a note of concern after Duchess Victoria's visit. Instead, when she opened it, the handwriting was brief, careful, and kind. Adrian wrote that he would be leaving for Boston within the week to consult a physician for his younger sister, whose health had worsened after months of uncertainty. He thanked Eleanor for reminding him that service could remain gentle even when the world was not. At the bottom, after the formal closing, he had added one final line. You deserve a life in which you are not grateful for crumbs of attention. Eleanor read the sentence once, then folded the letter with hands that did not tremble until it was closed. He had named the truth too plainly. That was the danger of kind men. They did not need to steal anything. They simply held up a mirror and asked why one had lived so long in a dim room. Before noon, Everett knocked at the morning room door. Eleanor looked up from the ledger. "Come in." He entered slowly, as if still learning the geography of rooms where she had once waited for him. "I came to ask whether you would allow the school accounts to be transferred under the primary estate fund." She blinked. "Why?" "Because you have been financing half of it from your private allowance." Her silence answered before she did. Everett's eyes lowered to the papers on her desk, the careful columns, the small economies, the marks beside families requiring coal, medicine, or tuition. "I should have known." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He accepted that without defense. That, more than the offer, unsettled her. "The fund will be permanent," he continued. "No annual petition. No dependence on private donors. I have already sent word to my solicitor." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "That will help them." "I know." "Do you?" The question was soft, but it opened a hollow place between them. Everett did not answer quickly. "I am beginning to understand how little I understood." Eleanor folded her hands on the desk to keep them still. "Beginning is not the same as repairing." "No," he stepped no closer. "But I would like to begin anyway." The room held the ticking of the mantel clock, the faint stir of rain in the gutters, and the unsentimental truth that a single decent act could not erase 7 years of absence. Eleanor wished he had done something unforgivable. It would have been easier, clearer. Instead, he stood before her with regret in his eyes and restraint in his posture, no longer demanding, no longer pretending, and the ache of it was nearly worse. "Everett," she said, using his name because the distance of his title suddenly felt dishonest. "You defended me yesterday. You opened the music room. You are helping the school. I will not pretend these things mean nothing." His face changed with cautious relief, but she lifted her hand before it could grow. "But do not mistake my gratitude for return." The relief vanished. "Eleanor, I am tired," she said, and for the first time her voice thinned at the edges. "Not from the school, not from your mother, not from gossip. I am tired from being noble inside a marriage that asked me to disappear politely." Everett's breath caught. She looked down at her wedding ring, then slowly removed it. The small circle rested in her palm, bright and terrible. "I will not leave today," she said. "There is too much work to finish. Too many people depend on decisions made from this house." She placed the ring on the desk between them. "But I cannot keep wearing a promise that was never lived." Everett stared at the ring as if it were not gold, but a verdict. Outside, the rain had stopped. A thin blade of winter sunlight broke through the clouds and touched the edge of the desk, illuminating the space between their hands. He did not reach for the ring. He did not reach for her. At last, he bowed his head. "What do you want from me?" Eleanor looked toward the window, where the south gardens waited in their wet, patient silence. "Nothing that can be demanded," she said. "Nothing that can be bought. Nothing that arrives only because another man reminded you I existed." Her eyes returned to his. "If you want to know me, begin as a stranger would. With humility, with patience, with no certainty that you will be welcomed." Everett stood very still. A duke was not raised to ask for permission to belong in his own house. A wounded man was not trained to knock before entering the heart he had once owned by law. Yet Eleanor had given him the only door left open, and it was narrower than pride could pass through. "Then I will knock," he said quietly. Eleanor's expression trembled, almost too faint to see. "We shall see whether I answer." That evening, when the house settled into candlelight, Everett did not dine in his study. He sat at the far end of the long table where Eleanor had eaten alone for years. He did not summon her. He did not send a note. He only waited, not as a husband expecting obedience, but as a man learning the shape of absence from the chair she did not fill. For 3 evenings, Everett sat at the dining table alone, and for the first time in 7 years, the silence did not obey him. It did not feel dignified. It did not feel restful. It sat across from him in Eleanor's empty chair, folded its invisible hands, and showed him the shape of every night she had endured without complaint. Mrs. Graves served the courses with the same precision as always, but even she seemed to understand that the untouched second-place setting had become a lesson no servant could remove. On the 4th morning, Eleanor left Blackwood Manor before sunrise. She took no grand trunk, no maid, no jewels beyond the pearl earrings she wore for propriety. Only a small traveling case, a dark cloak, and the stack of school documents she had promised to deliver to the parish board in Ashbourne. She told Mrs. Graves she would return by afternoon. Then fog settled heavily over the road. A bridge near Miller's Creek washed out from the week's rain, and by noon a message arrived stating that Her Grace had taken shelter at the old vicarage near the village until the lower road could be cleared. Everett read the note in the entrance hall. No danger, no crisis, no reason for panic. Yet the words old vicarage entered him with a coldness that no fire could answer. The old vicarage was 5 miles away, a plain stone house beside the abandoned chapel, used during winter months for parish relief and sick children when the schoolroom overflowed. Eleanor had gone there because someone needed her, not because she wanted distance from him, he told himself. But his hands closed around the paper until it bent. By late afternoon, he rode out alone. The road was wet, the air sharp with the smell of thawing earth, and low branches brushed his shoulders as he followed the narrow lane past fields where water gleamed in the furrows. He could have taken the carriage. He could have sent servants. He could have waited. But waiting had become the shape of his punishment, and this time, he would not make Eleanor the one who bore it. Lamplight glowed in the vicarage windows when he arrived. Through the glass, he saw her kneeling beside a little girl wrapped in a quilt, tying a blue ribbon around a cracked wooden doll. Her cloak had been set aside. Her sleeves were rolled to the wrist. A loose strand of hair curved against her cheek. She looked tired, deeply tired, but not diminished. Around her, children rested on pallets near the hearth while Miss Reed sorted blankets, and Mrs. Lane poured broth into tin cups. Eleanor moved through the room like a quiet flame, warming everything without asking who would warm her in return. Everett stood outside long enough for shame to find him. Then he knocked. The room turned. Eleanor rose slowly when she saw him at the door, and every careful word he had prepared vanished. "Your Grace," she said, formal again, though not unkind. "The road is passable by horseback, I see." "Barely." His voice was rough from cold and from something colder. "Mrs. Graves received your message. I said I would return when the bridge cleared." "I know." He stepped inside, removing his hat. The children stared at him, wide-eyed and solemn. Dukes did not belong in rooms with damp boots by the fire and broth cooling in tin cups. Everett knew that. More painfully, he knew Eleanor did. "I came because I wanted to ask whether you needed assistance." The words sounded simple. They cost him more than any command he had ever given. Eleanor studied him, searching for pride hidden beneath the offer. She found exhaustion, regret, a man standing at the threshold and not crossing farther than he was allowed. "There are blankets in the cart outside," she said at last. "If you mean what you said, bring them in." Everett bowed his head once. Of course. He carried them himself. One stack, then another. Fine wool against his dark coat, mud at the edge of his polished boots, rain in his hair. No one praised him. No one needed to. The work was small and therefore honest. When the last blanket had been laid near the hearth, Mrs. Lane handed him a cup of broth without thinking, then flushed in alarm. "Forgive me, Your Grace." Everett accepted it. "Thank you, Mrs. Lane." Eleanor saw the exchange and looked away too quickly. That small softness in her face nearly undid him. Near twilight, the children settled, and the room grew quiet. Eleanor stepped outside for air, pulling her cloak tight beneath the porch roof. The chapel bell, long and used, hung black against the fading sky. Everett followed but remained several feet away. For a while, neither spoke. Mist gathered in the grass. Water dripped from the eaves. "You should go back before the road worsens," she said. "Not without you." Her expression closed. "Everett." He heard the warning and lowered himself to one knee on the wet stone before she could finish. Not dramatically, not for witnesses. There was no ballroom, no mother, no rival, no title large enough to shield him. Only Eleanor, the rain, and the man he had become too late. "I am not here to claim you," he said, his voice breaking quietly around the words. "I forfeited the right to speak as though love were owed to me. I am here to ask, to beg, if begging is the only honest language left." Eleanor stood very still, one hand at her throat. "Please," Everett said, "let me learn you. Not as my Duchess, not as my duty, as Eleanor. If there is no room left for me in your heart, I will deserve that answer. But if there is even one locked door I have not destroyed, I will spend the rest of my life knocking gently enough not to frighten what remains behind it." Her eyes shone, though no tear fell. For a moment, the distance between them held 7 years, a schoolhouse, a ring on a desk, a room unlocked, and every dinner eaten alone. Then Eleanor whispered, "Stand up, Everett. I cannot answer a lifetime while you kneel in the rain." He obeyed. At once. That was the first answer he gave her without words. Eleanor did not return to Blackwood Manor as a forgiven wife, and Everett did not ask her to. That was the first proof that something in him had truly changed. They rode back from the old vicarage beneath a sky, clearing slowly over the dark fields, not side by side like lovers in a ballad, but with a respectful distance between their horses and a silence that no longer felt empty. It felt careful. When they reached the manor, Everett dismounted first, then waited beside the steps without offering his hand until Eleanor looked at him. Only then did he lift it. Only then did she decide whether to take it. Her gloved fingers rested in his for no more than a breath. But he received that brief touch as a starving man receives bread, not with possession, but with gratitude. In the weeks that followed, Blackwood Manor changed by inches. The music room remained open. Children from the village were invited once a month to hear Miss Reed play simple hymns on the old piano. The school fund became permanent, signed not in Eleanor's name alone, nor in Everett's alone, but as a joint trust of the Blackwood estate. Duchess Victoria sent 2 letters. Eleanor answered neither. Everett answered both, with courtesy sharp enough to end the matter. Count Adrian Caldwell departed for Boston with his sister, leaving behind no scandal, only a final note wishing Eleanor peace. She read it beside the south garden window and placed it among her private papers. Everett saw the seal, but did not ask to read the letter. Jealousy had opened his eyes. It would not be allowed to guide his hands. Every evening, he knocked at the morning room before entering. Sometimes Eleanor said yes. Sometimes she said she was occupied. Both answers were accepted. Slowly, he learned her life as one studies a language nearly lost through neglect. She preferred coffee with milk after luncheon, but tea without sugar in the afternoon. She disliked lilies because their scent reminded her of sick rooms. She counted the household candles herself because waste offended her more than poverty. She had once wanted to learn the piano, but stopped after being told the music room was forbidden. The day Everett placed a simple beginner's book of music upon the piano bench, he did not wait to be thanked. He left it there, beside a small vase of lavender. Spring arrived late that year, hesitant and pale, touching the estate first at the edges. Snow retreated from the stone walls. The south gardens sent up green shoots. On the evening of the county charity ball, Blackwood Manor filled with carriages, silk, candlelight, and all the polished cruelty of people who preferred old gossip to new truth. Eleanor wore silver-gray satin, not bridal, not mournful, but luminous in a restrained and dignified way. Her wedding ring remained in her jewel box. Everett did not ask about it. When they entered the ballroom together, conversation thinned. Some guests looked toward her hand, others toward his face. Duchess Victoria, standing near the fireplace, watched with a coldness that had once ruled entire rooms. Lady Ashcombe leaned toward a friend and whispered just loudly enough to be heard. "How touching. The forgotten Duchess has been brought out again." Eleanor's spine straightened. She did not flinch, but Everett felt the stillness enter her beside him. For 7 years, that stillness had been mistaken for weakness. Not tonight. He turned, and the room turned with him. "You are mistaken, Lady Ashcombe," he said, his voice calm enough to cut cleanly. "My wife was never forgotten by those whose lives she saved, educated, warmed, fed, and protected. She was only overlooked by those too small to recognize quiet greatness." The ballroom fell silent. Lady Ashcombe paled. Duchess Victoria's fan stopped moving. Everett did not look away from the crowd. "If Blackwood has any honor left, it is because Eleanor carried it when I did not." No one spoke. Then Mrs. Lane's son Samuel, present as part of the school choir, began to clap from near the musicians' gallery. One small sound, then another. Miss Reed joined him. The parish doctor, the steward, the tenants invited by Eleanor's insistence. At last, the applause moved through the room like thawing ice. Eleanor stood very still, not because she was afraid, but because recognition after long invisibility can feel almost as overwhelming as grief. Everett leaned slightly toward her, not touching. "Have I embarrassed you?" he asked quietly. Her mouth trembled, almost a smile. "A little." Shall I stop? She looked at him then, and the softness in her eyes was not surrender. It was choice. Not yet. Later, when the music began, Everett did not claim the first dance as a husband exercising right. He stood before her and bowed. May I have this dance, Eleanor? Around them, the room waited. Eleanor looked at the man who had once offered her comfort without love, then distance without cruelty, then repentance without demand. She thought of lonely dinners, white roses, an open music room, a knee bent in the rain, and a future that would not be healed in a single waltz. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. You may have this dance, she said. The rest must still be earned. Everett's fingers closed gently around hers. Then I will earn slowly. They moved beneath the chandeliers, not as a perfect couple, not as a finished story, but as two wounded people learning that love, when it comes after pain, must walk humbly before it can be trusted. Some women are not won by being claimed. They are loved rightly only when a man finally understands that the heart he wants must first be free to choose him.